Good afternoon. It's good to see you all here at the start of another year of the Behavior, Evolution, and Culture Speaker Series, an institution now in its 16th year. I'm Joe Manson. I'm organizing the series this year. To our newcomers, welcome. To our old hands, welcome back. We meet every Monday throughout the academic year. That is, every Monday when classes are in session at this time in this room, and occasionally there are talks on other days as well. To find the list of talks, you can just Google UCLA VEC, and our website will be at the top of the list. And there you can navigate to the page that lists upcoming talks. The talks for the entire academic year, or at least the speakers' names, are all posted thanks to the diligence and organization of Lisa Lambert, who will be my assistant this year. At every talk, we circulate a sign-in sheet. We ask you to sign that so that we can demonstrate to decision makers that there's a large constituency for these talks. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our generous sponsors, the UCLA units whose support makes these talks possible, the Division of Social Sciences, the Department of Anthropology, the Institute for Society and Genetics, the Coates Institute of Archaeology, the Department of Communication Studies, and the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. Before introducing today's speaker, a preview of coming attractions. Next Monday, we'll hear from Richard McElraith of UC Davis. The title of his talk is The Endogenous Dorito, the Cultural Evolution of Evolutionary Mismatch. And the following Monday, that's October 14th, our speaker will be David Nolan of Boise State University, and he'll speak on what goes around comes around, cyclicity as a statistical test of generalized reciprocity in social network data. Today, we're very pleased to welcome Lee Cronk of Rutgers University, and the title of his talk is Our Cultural Immune System Towards a Theory of Culture's Influence on Behavior.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay? And can you hear me okay on the mic? Okay, great. Thanks. And thank you so much for this invitation. This is a famous series, and it's a privilege to be here as part of it. I should say at the outset that you'll see some slides in here of graphs and so on that have been published, but the overall argument I'm going to present is not published yet. It's still on the speculative side. So if you want to treat it more like a workshop than a formal talk, that's fine with me. You can ask questions, whatever you want. Because I am hoping, especially with this particular audience, hoping that this stimulates some discussion and some feedback and so on and so forth. So again, my topic is this idea of a cultural immune system in a metaphorical sense. But my more specific topic in a non-metaphorical sense is the influence of culture on behavior, understanding why culture influences our behavior strongly sometimes, and yet in other circumstances not so much, sometimes not at all. Legitimate question to ask is, why should we care about this relationship between culture and behavior? I think there's at least three reasons why we ought to care. One I don't have a slide for, and that's simply scientific curiosity. The job of scientists is to understand the cause and effect relationships in our universe, and one of the common powers attributed to culture is to cause behavior, but we don't really understand that in any sort of detailed way. We don't, in my opinion anyway, we don't have a good understanding of exactly how that works. And I see that as a major gap in the behavioral and social sciences that we should try to fill somehow. There's two other more practical reasons why we should care about this, at least two others. One is what's called the cultural defense. So this is one particular advocate of the cultural defense, Alison Dundas-Rintel up at Berkeley, one of your UC colleagues up at Berkeley, who's argued that in this book, that in some circumstances at least, it's legitimate for people who are accused of crimes to use what I sometimes call the "my culture made me do it" defense. The idea that in certain circumstances, culture robs us of our agency so that we aren't responsible for what we do. We're doing culture's dictates. This is attributed by some scholars to what's called the doctrine of cultural compulsion, that sometimes culture compels us to do things. In principle, I don't have a problem with this as a possible defense in some circumstances. It's usually used in cases of immigrants, where they come to this country or some other country with cultural ideas that don't match up with the ones of the society they've come to, and they end up breaking the law and using this as a defense. I think that it may be legitimate in some circumstances, but I would feel more comfortable with it if we had a better understanding of how this works. How is it that culture sometimes has such power over our actions that we ourselves are not to blame for them in some sense? I don't think that's well established. Another practical reason why we might want to know about this is because we might want to use culture to change people's behavior. Now, of course, we do this all the time. We're all the time, if you define culture the way I do, which I'll get to in a minute, then we are always, I'm doing it right now, trying to take ideas and repackage them and send them out and influence other people's behavior. But if we understand this relationship, we might be able to do that in a more systematic way. This is not an idea that was one of the ones that motivated me to do this kind of work in the first place. And it wouldn't have occurred to me if it hadn't been pointed out to me by these folks at this place called DCDC. It's the Decision Center for a Desert City. It's at Arizona State. Folks at DCDC, as you can tell from the name, they worry about life in a desert city, Phoenix specifically, and the broader Phoenix area, and how they're going to make it as a large metropolis in an area with very limited water supply, especially since people like to have their golf courses and so on. And they heard about some of the research I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about a system of risk pooling that I studied among Maasai pastoralists in Kenya. They got wind of that through the grapevine and are interested in the possibility that that system of risk pooling might provide an extra tool for the management of water in central Arizona. And so we've got a little bit, some projects going on to explore the possibility that this might be helpful to the water managers. There's a lot of different water managers in central Arizona, some controlling large water sources, some small, some private, some public, whole combination of them, very heterogeneous group. So perhaps there's hope that this culture trait that I'll tell you about might help these folks solve a practical problem. Maybe. So that might be a practical benefit. The problem is that we don't know very much about what the relationship is between culture and behavior. Here's one of my intellectual heroes, Roy Dondrati, is a cognitive anthropologist. Some of you know him quite well, actually. He summed this up about 21 years ago in an edited volume, saying that he talked about action rather than behavior, but similar sort of concept. People can say people do what they do because their culture makes them do it. This formulation doesn't explain anything. Do people always do what their culture tells them to do? If they do, why do they? If they don't, why don't they? And how does their culture make them do it? Finally, I italicized this. Unless there's some specification of how culture makes people do what they do, no explanation has been given. So I'd like to fill that gap. Now, that was 20 years ago. There has been some work done on this in those intervening years, but to my mind, we're still pretty far from a solid theory of how exactly this works. Another word of caution before we really get into it. This is another one of my intellectual heroes, George Williams, famous evolutionary biologist. Back in '66, when he wrote his landmark book, Adaptation and Natural Selection, he said, okay, adaptation, that book is mostly known as a critique of group selectionism, but it had a lot more to say than that. And one of his messages was that adaptation is a special and onerous concept that should be used only where it's really necessary. I think he was right about the concept of adaptation, but I also think that those of us who study culture can scratch out adaptation and write in culture, and will be correct as well. I think that all too often culture is used as an easy explanation of behavior, even when the details are left unspecified as to how that's working. And I'd like to instead use culture more carefully and invoke it as an explanation of behavior where it's justified in being invoked in that way. And this opens up the door to the possibility that there are other things besides culture that may influence behavior. Biological things, genes, hormones, and so on and so forth, and perhaps other sorts of social influences, peer pressure, and so on and so forth. That I'm comfortable with that. The opening up of the door to explain behavior, especially human behavior, using something other than culture. I know it makes some people uncomfortable. To many folks in anthropology, I think culture is how you explain human behavior. And when you explain non-human behavior, you may use other concepts. But for humans, you use culture. I would rather wait and see and say, yes, let's take specific behaviors and see whether they need culture in order to be explained. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. That's a totally normal thing to do if you study non-humans. But if you study humans, it's a little unusual, but I think it's a necessary step. There's some seats over there if you want to sneak across, feel free. So I've got 9 steps towards a theory. I gave a talk like this a little while ago, and I had 8 steps, and then I looked at the slides and decided I needed one more step. So there's no magic about the number 9. But this is what I got right now. I got 9 steps. So follow me through these steps, if you will. There's at least two different traditions in the social sciences. One is well known to cultural anthropologists. It's associated with the German word verstehen, understanding. It's associated with folks like Dilthey and Weber and Gertz and a variety of other folks. It focuses on the hermeneutic interpretive approach, the sort of gut level understanding of behavior. And I have no problem with that. I mention it because I think that one of the reasons why we haven't made much progress on this specific question is because so much work on culture is done within that tradition. It's a fine tradition. It's very, if you want to have very compelling and evocative ethnography, that's the tradition in which to work. But it's not the only tradition. There's another tradition in the social and behavioral sciences that takes what in German would be called an Erklären approach, which focuses on cause and effect explanations, like the rest of the sciences do. And I think I added this slide, I'm realizing right now, because I gave a talk, not quite on this topic, but on a similar topic, to an audience that included Clifford Gertz's widow. And it was clear that she was very uncomfortable with the approach I was taking. So I'm going to make it explicit. I'm taking an approach that is not within the Verstehen tradition, it's within the Erklären tradition. Cause and effect explanations. I think it's necessary to make progress on this topic. And again, I don't think that with this audience, I doubt this is going to be too controversial, but it ought to be on the table. Another thing, something I've advocated actually for years now, is that in order to make progress on the use of culture and the explanation of behavior, we need to separate culture from behavior. We need to define them in a way that they don't overlap. Lots and lots of definitions of culture that are popular in anthropology include behavior within those definitions, so they do overlap within many definitions. The problem with that is that it makes it difficult to have non-circular explanations of behavior in terms of culture that aren't circular and overlapping. So rather than that, I would prefer that we, at least for the purposes of this talk and this research agenda, define culture as socially transmitted information. So a very stripped down definition. This is in keeping actually with a tradition both in cultural anthropology and a tradition in evolutionary anthropology. On the cultural side, you've had people, at least since the 1950s, mostly coming out of a cognitive anthropological framework, also symbolic anthropology and some of the interpretive work as well, like Clifford Gertz, arguing that the way to go is with an ideational definition, a definition of culture that focuses on the ideational bits, beliefs, knowledge, and so on. In my case, information is how I'm phrasing it. This is also standard in ethology and animal behavior studies and in evolutionary anthropology. And again, the reason, the payoff for it is that it means that when you're using culture to explain behavior, you're avoiding circularity. And that, to my mind, is crucial. Step number 3 is you got to break the problem down. If all we do all day long is talk about the relationship between culture over here as some big thing and behavior over here as some other big thing, we're never going to make any progress. So we need to break that down and think about individual culture traits, which is, I know, is a problematic issue, but not that problematic. There are ways in which you can decide that something is a culture trait that can be distinguished from other culture traits, and specific behaviors. So rather than say, what's the relationship between culture and behavior in big sense, look at the relationship between individual culture traits and individual behaviors. So this is good in terms of being anti-essentialist, which is, again, something that a lot of cultural anthropology these days has in common with the evolutionary approach, because after all, Darwin was the original anti-essentialist, focusing on variation, not on the essential essence of species. There's this anthropological truism that all human behavior is influenced by culture, and I think that's true. I have no problem with that, sort of as a broad statement in some sense, maybe some, at least as a context for behavior. But that does not mean this. That does not mean that all culture traits influence behavior. You can't make that leap. So there may be culture traits that influence behavior, and there may be culture traits that don't. And the trick for developing this theory is figuring out which is which, or which at least is likely to be which. So that's step 3. Got 6 more to go. Ready? Okay. Step 4, consider culture traits that have clear behavioral reference, culture traits that refer clearly to specific behaviors. Because if we're defining culture as socially transmitted information, then there may be many culture traits that don't have clear behavioral reference. They're simply information that's being transferred. So for instance, if I say polar bears live in the Arctic, that's a bit of socially transmitted information, one that we probably all knew before we walked in. But if you know someone knows that, you're not going to have any leg up on it predicting their behavior than if you didn't know that they know it, unless you know something else about them. Like if you know that they also have a desire to hunt polar bears, then you can expect that they will, upon hearing this news, they will go to the Arctic. But by itself, it doesn't give you any, there's no behavioral referent there, so we don't get any improvement in our ability to predict somebody's behavior. Here's one with a clear behavioral referent: give 10% of your income to charity. That's about a specific behavior. So if we narrow our focus, this allows us not to worry about, again, culture generally, but about certain particular bits of culture, certain kinds of culture traits. These sorts of admonitions to give to charity. And I picked this one on purpose because obviously it doesn't always work. There's plenty of admonitions to give to charity and do other kinds of things that people don't do. One of the admonitions within my grandparents' church was tithe 10% to the church, and I always heard that they did, but it was also known that not everybody did. So some of these traits work, and sometimes with some people, not with others. Step 5, take a ceteris paribus, all other things being equal approach. This is tough, but I think it's necessary, at least intellectually, in order to get the ball rolling. So there's many, many things that may influence whether or not a particular culture trait influences behavior or not, besides just the characteristics of the trait itself. These are, down at the bottom here, context-related biases. Things like model effects. Is the model, the person who's presenting this behavioral option for you, displaying a particular culture trait, an attractive model in some sense? Are they prestigious, or are they similar to you? Is there coercion involved? Is there peer pressure involved? Do we have a conformity bias that leads us to conform to local behavioral norms? All those things are fascinating and they're really interesting, and if you read the literature on cultural transmission, you'll read about them. But they are context-related biases, and what I'd like to do, and again, I recognize this is difficult, is to the extent possible, set those aside, keep them constant, and focused on the content of the trait. What is the trait about? What behavior does it refer to? And then down the road, of course, ideally, you develop a theory and then you can start relaxing these kinds of things and looking at the interactions between content and context and getting more sophisticated about it. But right now, I don't think we're ready to be too sophisticated. We've got to be simple. Step 6 is crucial, I think, and that is to think of it in terms of gene-culture coevolution. And Bill Durham's book is not the only work ever on gene-culture coevolution, but I like it. So it's my poster child for gene-culture coevolutionary theory. Culture traits can lead people to do things that are costly as well as things that are beneficial to themselves. Because of that, we should have co-evolved, culture and our cultural immune system should have co-evolved so that we are resistant to some kinds of culture traits and not resistant or more open to other kinds of culture traits. Not too controversial a statement. This is all grounded in, again, ideas of coevolution and the epidemiological metaphor for culture, the idea that culture spreads sometimes in a disease-like fashion, and so may lead us to do things that are not good for ourselves. We should have evolved some resistance to those kinds of traits, but also a susceptibility to traits that routinely help us in some way, that routinely benefit us. One of the reasons why I think that progress has not been made on this topic over the past 20 years is because people haven't been working within this tradition. There has been some work done on a more proximate level within a cognitive anthropological tradition, which is good, and I think, again, I think probably everybody's familiar with levels of explanation. So there's a complementarity between explanations at different levels, but I think taking a step back and focusing on it from this ultimate or distal level of explanation in terms of selection pressures is necessary to develop the idea. Step 7. This is the one I added. Consider different cultural realms. So many of you, I think, are familiar with Rob Kurzban, an evolutionary psychologist at Penn. And he argued, he had a small chapter in a book called Evolution of Mind a few years ago, 2007, in which he argued that we should have evolved, the same argument I've been making, that we should have evolved to be skeptical towards some kinds of culture traits and gullible towards others. Those are his terminology, skeptical and gullible. And on the gullibility side, he pointed out that, for the entire study, we should think about culture not as a whole, but different cultural realms, culture traits that are about different sorts of things. So, for instance, technology. He argued that if a particular technology is clearly helpful to you in accomplishing your goals, that you ought to go ahead and use that technology. Again, all other things being equal, you ought to go ahead and use that technology. So in that sense, the effectiveness of a technology should be a good predictor of the extent to which we are gullible for that technology. That's interesting enough by itself, but I'd like to go beyond that. So he made another observation which I find much more interesting than that, and which I want to pursue in the rest of the talk. He points out that the conventional meanings of words and other linguistic conventions are also something for which we ought to be gullible. We shouldn't be resistant to them. If we're trying to learn a new language, and a native Spanish speaker tells us that the word in Spanish for table is mesa, we shouldn't, rub our chins and say, well, I don't know about that. Doesn't sound quite right to me. The point of language, okay, let me take a step back. Language is about many things once it exists. We can use it for all kinds of stuff. I think its sort of fundamental role in human society and why it took off and why it's so crucial for human existence is coordination. It helps us coordinate our behavior. It helps us get on the same page and gives us common knowledge, provided with common knowledge about how to get along with each other, work with each other, cooperate with each other. And in order for it to do that, we have to be suckers for these things like conventional meanings of words and other linguistic conventions. We have to agree with others on what words mean. Not always easy. Think the culture concept in anthropology. This is not necessarily an easy thing to do when people have vested interest in different sorts of approaches and definitions. But ideally, we ought to be gullible when we're learning a new language about what particular words mean, because they are solutions to coordination problems. If they're solutions to coordination problems, is that why they're so useful to us? Then you can start with Kurzban's observation, you can go beyond it and talk about coordination conventions more broadly. Coordination conventions, things that solve coordination problems. So this is where I'm going to go with the rest of the talk. So I want to make sure everybody knows what I mean by coordination problems. A brief aside on coordination problems. So I just co-authored a book with my wife on the study of cooperation. And one of the lessons of the book is that there's really just two things that get in the way of cooperation. One of them is the collective action dilemma, which arise from conflict of interest. So where people would benefit from cooperation happening, but they'd also benefit if somebody else would do the work. There's a temptation to free ride. That's a real problem. However, I don't want to talk about it today. That's not what I'm getting into. I want to get in instead to coordination problems. In a pure coordination problem, there's no conflict of interest. There's just simply a lack of common knowledge. Everybody would benefit from getting their act together and coordinating their efforts in some way, but they lack the common knowledge to do it. So the question then becomes, well, how do they get that common knowledge? Where are they going to get that from? I just said all that stuff. Lack common knowledge about how to do so. So what you need is a social coordination norm or convention that will solve a coordination problem. Let me warn you ahead of time, I tend to say social coordination norm, but because the word norm has multiple meanings in the social sciences, I actually think it's a better idea probably to say social coordination convention, because that's really what I'm talking about, a convention whereby a coordination problem is solved. So I'll try to do that, but I know that sometimes I slip into the use of the word norm. Examples. Meeting at Grand Central. This is, again, shameless plug for our book. This is what our book is entitled. And it's based on an experiment done by Thomas Schelling back in about 1959. The book was published in 1960 called Strategy of Conflict. He was at Yale, and so as a little experiment on the coordination of social behavior, he ran around New Haven, Connecticut, and interviewed people and said, well, imagine that you're in Manhattan, you're in New York City, and you have agreed with a friend to meet in the city, but you have failed to agree on a particular time and a particular place. And this is 1959, so there's no cell phones. Can't overcome this problem that way. What are you going to do? Where are you going to go and when are you going to go there in order to increase your likelihood of actually meeting this other person? And the majority of the people said that they would go to Grand Central Terminal at noon. So why noon? Noon is an obvious, what Schelling would call a salient focal point solution to the coordination problem. It's a prominent time, easy to pick. It's the time this talk started, for instance. Here we all are, coordinating our behaviors so beautifully. Why Grand Central? Well, these folks were from New Haven, Connecticut, and New Haven's trains, their commuter trains, come into Grand Central. They don't I live in Jersey, and they don't arrive in Grand Central from Jersey, they don't arrive in Grand Central from Long Island, so if you ask folks in those places, you might get a different response. But for folks from New Haven, this was the most likely social coordination convention that would solve the problem. A less sort of artificial, a more common one is just what side of the road do you drive on? It doesn't matter which side of the road you drive on as long as everybody else is driving on that same side of the road. It's a very bad idea to go to England and drive on the right side or go out here and drive on the left side. You've got to stick with, it's to everybody's benefit to stick with the coordination convention. But it doesn't matter which one it is. As long as everybody knows, common knowledge, you got to have common knowledge. From there I can make some observations and some predictions. So this slide's wordy, it'll take a little bit of time. When a culture trait helps coordinate social behavior, then our behavior has to correspond with it or we won't get the benefits of social coordination. So if that's been true throughout human evolution, then we ought to have evolved a susceptibility, a gullibility in Kurzban's terminology, to social coordination conventions. We ought to find it easy to follow them. And we should be less resistant, just as we should not say, well, I don't know if that really ought to be called a mesa. I'm not sure that's a good word for it. We shouldn't say those kinds of things. We should also say, well, social coordination convention, okay, I'll go ahead with that, even though it might not be the one I would have picked. If other folks are doing it, if it's the one that seems to be working, I'll follow along. That's number one. So the prediction would be number one. If the idea here is we're going to try to use our knowledge of people's cultural knowledge to predict behavior, that if we know that they've been exposed to a particular social coordination convention, that ought to improve our ability to predict their behavior compared to some other kinds of culture traits that concern other kinds of behaviors. Individual behaviors that don't require social coordination, say. In that case, this isn't going to help us predict their behavior. Number two, if a social coordination convention is well established, so well-established social coordination conventions should continue to be good predictors of behavior, and even when other conventions would be more effective if they're more popular. This is actually among those who study coordination conventions, coordination norms, this is a well-established idea. They have staying power. There's sort of path dependence to these kinds of things, because once they're established, they're hard to get rid of, because they're solving the problem. Even if something else would solve the problem better, the existence of any solution to a social coordination problem is better than none, and so even a bad one will have staying power. Number three is people's tendency to behave in accordance with social coordination norms will be robust. And what I mean by robust is that they'll do so even in the face of short-term costs. So even if doing so imposes a little bit of a cost on themselves, our evolved gullibility, our evolved susceptibility to these kinds of traits should overwhelm that and lead people to go along with it. Again, focusing on short-term costs. In the long run, if you're talking about a very costly social coordination convention, I would expect people to get past it and try to find ways to overcome that cost. And number four, cultural distinctions among human groups will be based more on social coordination conventions than on other types of culture traits. Because again, these things have staying power where they get developed, and you may get one over here that's well developed, another one over here that's quite different but very well developed and well established. And so these differences between groups can become established in the arena of social coordination conventions, whereas other kinds of behaviors that don't require social coordination can change and may become quite similar because they're not constrained by this bit of the susceptibility to social coordination conventions. So far, so good. I'll come back to these. Step 8, ask a different question. So I've hinted at this already. Rather than saying what's the relationship between behavior and culture, these are giant constructs that we can't really break down. Break it down, as I've described already, and ask this question instead. If we know that someone has been exposed to a particular culture trait, how much does that improve our ability to predict his or her behavior? So that's a question that you can actually go do a research project on. You can't really do a research project on what is the relationship between behavior and culture. It's just too amorphous. But you can do this. You can say, okay, exposure to a trait, does it help us predict their behavior or not? That's tractable. Step 9, develop a new method. This is an optional step in the sense that I'm sure there's many, many methods that could be used for this. Going back to the cognitive folks, there's a anthropologist at Alabama named Bill Dressler who's done a lot of really interesting work on what he calls cultural consonance, looking at the fit or lack of fit between the cultural image, cultural ideal, and behavior on specific topics, specific kinds of behaviors. And he's got a lot of really interesting data from his field site in Brazil on how these things can match up or fail to match up, and that in turn can have consequences for health outcomes and things like that. Very interesting stuff. So there's other methods out there that could shed light on this. But I haven't used that method. This is the method I've used. So it's the one I'm going to talk about today. And I think it does, it's an interesting one that does shed light on this. So intersocietal transfer of culture traits, it is what it sounds like. Finding a culture trait in one particular setting, figuring out at least roughly what its association with behavior is in that setting, where it originates, and then seeing if you can replicate it in a different setting to get a grip on how culture has this influence on behavior. So, moving on to the actual data. So, most of the data from this, well, about half of the data roughly that I'll talk about today, come from my field site in Kenya. These folks have a complicated ethnic history. They are masters of what I like to call ethnicity management, meaning that they will change what they call themselves depending on the audience present. They're very strategic about this kind of thing. So in different settings, they will refer to themselves as Mukogoto, which is how I often refer to them as Mukogoto, or Maasai, or combination of the two, Mukogoto Maasai. If you want to read all about their ethnicity management and that whole history, you can read in my little book, From Mukogoto to Maasai. For the purposes of this talk today, I'm going to refer to them as Maasai because the particular culture trait I'll be talking about is not a specifically Mukogoto culture trait, it's a Maasai culture trait. And also part of my work was done not just among the Mukogoto who are over here, but also among one of their neighboring groups called the Digiri. And the only term that both the Mukogoto and the Digiri would use for themselves in common would be Maasai. So for today's lecture, Maasai. We'll call it Maasai. What about the Maasai? There is an economic anthropologist that some of you might be familiar with named Steve Gudeman, who was at the University of Minnesota, who suggested back in the 80s that every society understands its own economy through the use of some central metaphor. And he offered a few illustrative examples of this. I don't know if he's right or not because his theory hasn't really been put to a rigorous test, but it has a certain intuitive appeal to it, especially in my case because if there is a central metaphor for the Maasai economy, it's Osotwa, this metaphor of the umbilical cord. So the word Osotwa's literal meaning is the human umbilical cord, but its metaphorical meaning is a particular kind of gift-giving relationship. And the thing to understand about it, I'll elaborate on this in the next couple of slides, is that it's not just any old kind of gift-giving relationship. They have lots of gift-giving relationships. It's a particular kind of gift-giving relationship that has very specific expectations and obligations and rules that go with it. And I'll explain those now. So, Osotwa involves gifts and favors of many kinds. So there's ways in which you can establish an Osotwa relationship through the request for a favor, like asking somebody to be your best man at your wedding. That'll do it. Being the best man at a Maasai wedding is a lot of work. So that's a major favor. And that can get a relationship established. But because it's a livestock-based economy, these folks are pastoralists, inevitably the bulk of the Osotwa gifts, the things that pass between the Osotwa partners are livestock. So that's really the way to think of it as a system of livestock exchange primarily. There's this principle in Maasai social relationships of enkanyet, which means respect. And it's I would argue anyway, and I'm sure other Maasai ethnographers would as well, argue that enkanyet is the sort of fundamental principle of Maasai social relationships. You're supposed to carry yourself with respect, and you're supposed to treat others with respect. That's the ideal. And one of my informants gave me this great quote that Osotwa and enkanyet go together, Osotwa in the lead and enkanyet behind. So they're very tied up. So the Osotwa relationships are very much wrapped up with the idea of respect. Another one said that these relationships are weighty. Keiroshi means they're heavy. They're big responsibility. So there's a lot of respect, big responsibility. The way this works is that Gifts are requested due to need. It has to be real need. You don't just do it because you want to have a buddy that you want to exchange gifts with. No, you got to need it. And if you agree to be in one of these relationships, then you are then supposed to give in response to those requests that are based on real need, freely and from the heart. And most importantly, this is really the most important thing about it, without the idea of payment or the idea of debt. When I went into this, studying this stuff a few years ago, I was kind of assuming at the outset that it would be a fairly typical, what I thought anyway was a fairly typical system of balanced reciprocity in Solons's terms, where there's notions of repayment and debt and back and forth and so on and so forth. No, there's not that idea. There's no debt. There's no payment. They have those words, they have those concepts, and they use them in other contexts. But within the context of one of these relationships, you're not supposed to use those words. Rather than being, there is a reciprocity in that there's a reciprocal obligation to help when there's need. But there's no expectation of reciprocity in terms of balanced reciprocity or tit-for-tat reciprocity in terms of the amounts going back and forth. So the flow of goods and services may be all in one direction if that's where the need is. That's okay. Within one of these relationships, that's okay, and that does not create debt. So it's quite different than what I thought it was when I set out. So, you know, ethnography pays off. You can learn interesting, cool things. To learn more, is that okay? Everybody okay with those so far? Okay, a little more quantitative stuff now. I didn't bother to study OSO. I wanted to ever since I started working with these folks back in the 80s, but I didn't study it because I didn't feel like I had a tool that I could use. I wanted a quantitative tool that I could use to kind of get into it with. And then the game method came along. And so I decided to use the trust game, the experimental economic game called the trust game, because it's a two-person game that has a little bit of a back and forth quality like Osotwa. In the trust game, you've got two players. The version I used, both players have an initial endowment provided by the researcher. In this case of 100 shillings, which is like $1.30, not a lot by our standards, but significant by their standards. And then player one can give any proportion of his pot over to player two. At that point, we also asked player one, again, the game is explained to everybody, how much player one expected to get back from player two. Player two receives that initial 100 shilling endowment, plus however much player one transferred over multiplied by 3. So it's multiplied and then transferred over. And then player two can give any proportion of his money back to player one. So at this point, from player two's point of view, it's kind of like a dictator game. You can give any amount back, you can give nothing back, all of it, whatever you want. But it's got the extra twist that some of your money is coming from the other individual. Hence the idea of a trust game. Also sometimes known as an investment game. So it's the notion of investment by player one. So I played these games. 50 games total. 25 games I played unframed, just said, here's a game, here's how you play it. Made sure everybody understood, then played the game. And then the other 25 games were framed with the minimal statement, this is an Osotwa game. So again, basic training in how the game works, make sure everybody understands it, then play the game, but with that extra sentence as a frame. And of course, the framing condition was the same for both players in each game. So there's player one, and as you can see, this is the unframed games only. Lots of people give 50%. This is a very common finding in experimental economic game studies. These situations are unusual and strange, and a lot of people, not really knowing what to do, give 50%. So that's a pretty standard result. And you can see this finding has been out for a while, so many of you probably are, well, some of you anyway, I know at least one of you, already knows what the next thing is going to be. What do you think happens when the game is framed? If you already know the answer, keep your hand down. But if you don't know the answer, how many of you think it's going to go up? Raise your hand. Okay, a bunch of people. And how many people think it's going to go down? One person. Anybody think it's going to stay the same? That wouldn't be interesting, would it? So nobody's going to raise their hand for that. Well, you were right. It goes down. Again, a lot of people do 50%, but the percent who do that goes down. It shifts to the left. And the same thing happens with player two. Shifts to the left. And the same thing happens no matter how you slice it. Player one, player two, amounts expected in return. It all gets lower when the Osotwa frame is on there. And this was, so I had a preliminary analysis of these data while I was still in the field. And they surprised me because I felt the same way that most of you did, except for you, that they would probably go up, right? Because Osotwa is about giving, generosity. No, it's not. It's about restraint, responsibility, respect, all these other things. So I re-interviewed people, and they said, well, of course that's what you got. You said it was an Osotwa game. What did you expect? I'm like, oh, okay. So it was a lesson to me in the nice back and forth that you can get between qualitative and quantitative methods. I learned, the reason why I think I understand Osotwa now is because I played the games and then asked more questions. That happened across the board. Everything goes down with the framing. There's some bivariate effects that are interesting too. Here's how much player one transferred across the bottom, and here's the proportion that they expected in return. And in the unframed games, there's a regression line because many of them, apparently, based on the positive slope there, had a sort of tit-for-tat expectation. If I give more, I should get more back. The frame games, there's no line because there's enough of them. I won't say that the tit-for-tat expectation was completely wiped out by the Osotwa frame. That would be jumping beyond my database. But I will say that it was diminished enough that you no longer get a significant regression line over on the right-hand side. So enough people are thinking in non-tit-for-tat terms in the framed games that you don't get a significant regression line. Here's another bivariate relationship that's kind of interesting. So here's the proportion that's actually returned. Here's how much player one gave. And as you can see, in terms of proportion returned, the player ones were disappointed. Their expectation was not met. Remember, from player two's point of view, it's a dictator game. They don't really have to give anything. In the frame games, on the other hand, there is a significant relationship there, but it's a negative one. So why would there be a negative one? Well, my interpretation of this is that, remember that Osotwa is about the communication of need, and there is no communication between these individuals except in terms of what player one gives. And which might be an interesting thing to modify in future games, actually. But that's it for this particular application of the game. All that player two knew about player one was what player one gave. And as you can see, there's a negative relationship here such that if player one gives more, less is given back. If player one gives less, more is given back as a proportion of the player two's pot. This seems to be a response to need. That people who give more apparently are not terribly needy. People who give less may be expressing need in that way. So you get a significant relationship in the negative direction that way. So how do we interpret these? Well, the first bullet point up there, the unframed game is about trust, reciprocity, investment, and tit-for-tat reasoning. Now this was, when this was published in Evolution of Human Behavior, and it was edited by your esteemed colleague Dan Fessler, and he made sure that I got that point in there. I don't know if you remember this detail, but you did. Because the people who designed the trust game deserve credit for having come up with a game that, when taken to this unusual cultural setting, very different from where it was invented, if you play it with no framing on it, it's about what they thought it should be about. It's about reciprocity, trust, investment, tit-for-tat reasoning. So good for the game. But if you slap a frame on it, and particularly the Osotwa frame, then it becomes something else. It's not about those things anymore. It starts to be about need, obligation, responsibility, respect, restraint, all the things that are wrapped up in the Osotwa concept. For those who understand the Osotwa concept. You got to understand the Osotwa concept for this to work. So, there's your culture trait. Osotwa. Does it work if you move it to some other place, the intersocietal transfer? So for this project, I teamed up with my former grad student, Helen Wasilewski. She finished up a year or two ago. And pretended to be psychologists and recruited undergraduates and put them through a laboratory exercise where we mimicked what we did in the Kenyan study with a few twists. So these folks are playing on computers instead of face-to-face, or I mean, you know, face-to-face with a researcher, that is. The Kenyan games were anonymous. And we had 210 subjects. 2/3 of them read about the Maasai and they read about Osotwa. So they heard all the same stuff you heard today about these people and about Osotwa without any of the stuff about the games. Because obviously mentioning anything about how these people played the trust games would contaminate the whole thing, be cheating. 2/3 read that, and then 1/3 read a dummy frame about the Earth's atmosphere and meteorology. The idea of the dummy frame was just that we wanted to get a baseline for how people play the trust game in this setting. But we were concerned that just on the slim possibility that simply reading a text and doing a short quiz, 10-question multiple choice quiz about the text, could have some impact on how people play the game. So rather than have no framing at all, we had this dummy frame. We picked meteorology because we didn't think it would trigger any social cognition mechanisms. It didn't seem likely to, as opposed to, say, a text about animal behavior, something like that. The dummy frame was interesting and it was worth doing, but it doesn't enter into the rest of the talk. But I can talk about it afterwards if you want to hear what happened in the dummy frame. After they read all that stuff, they got either general instructions or the Osotwa game instructions, which are identical except that it says the Osotwa game at the top. Everybody who read the dummy frame obviously got general instructions because they would have no idea what Osotwa means. And half of the people who read about Maasai and Osotwa got this general instruction, mimicking in this artificial setting the folks in Kenya who know all about Osotwa from having grown up there, but who are not prompted to think about the game in Osotwa terms. And then the folks on the right, that's half of the folks who read about the Maasai got those instructions, mimicking the folks in Kenya who got the framed games. So what happens? Well, I think I'm here talking to you about this, so it's pretty predictable what's going to happen. It replicated the Kenyan findings. So we got the same results we got in Kenya pretty much across the board. Player 1 gives less, player 1 expects less in return, player 2 gives less, and so on and so forth. So we're getting an interesting result with people who have only heard about this concept within the past 15 to 20 minutes. There's some bivariate relationships that are kind of interesting too. So this is the same thing you saw earlier, proportion expected in return. These are the Kenyan findings on the left-hand side, and those same graphs. On the right-hand side is the US results, and you can see the result is pretty similar there, where you get a tit-for-tat sort of expectation in the unframed games, but enough people stop thinking about it in those terms in the framed games that you don't get a significant regression line over here in the frame games. And this is obviously we had to adjust for the fact that the currencies are different and so on and so forth, but that's not tough to do. And this is percent given by player 1 across the bottom, and the amount actually returned, not the proportion returned, but the amount, the actual raw amount actually returned. And in this case, if you look at amount returned, then in the Kenyan setting, you do get a tit-for-tat response in the sense that those who gave more received more on average. You also get that in the US, and again, down here below, when there's an Osotwa frame on it, you don't get that. You don't get any significant relationship between the two variables in the framed ones. So again, enough people are reducing the extent to which they think in tit-for-tat terms, thanks to the framing, presumably, that you're not getting a significant finding down here on the bottom. So that's the groundwork, and what I want to do in the next few minutes anyway is say, can we generalize this? So we've got some interesting data here that are relevant, I think, to this question of the influence of culture on behavior. Can you generalize it and you can say something more broadly about this relationship that could lead to future tests? I think so. So what is it about these traits? What is it about social coordination norms and conventions? Well, I would like to argue that one of their characteristics is that their effectiveness in helping people achieve their goals. How good are they at helping you do what you want to do in life? You know, whether it's, as you'll see in a second, chop down a tree or work with others on common projects. There's lots of things we want to do. So if you can think of a variable of effectiveness, how effective is a culture trait in helping us accomplish a goal, in some cases, that effectiveness will be a function of how frequent it is in the population and sometimes not. So for instance, imagine this situation. You want to chop down a tree, and you have here in front of you 3 tools with which to chop down the tree. You've got a stone axe, a steel axe, and a chainsaw. And this is, again, ceteris paribus, all other things being equal, sort of reasoning. Imagine that you are equally adept at using all these tools. There's no problem with fuel for the chainsaw. You're not going to bother neighbors. There's no other things to be considered other than how effective is this tool at helping you chop that tree down as fast as possible. Well, and you know how to use them all. Then you're going to use the chainsaw, obviously. So the frequency with which other people are using chainsaws, axes, or stone axes in the population doesn't matter. You're just going to pick the best one. I realize there's an artificiality to this example, and that even a behavior like this takes place in a social context. Pretend it doesn't, for the time being. More often, especially for the kinds of traits that I'm interested in, the frequency of the trait in the population is going to relate to the effectiveness of the trait. The more frequent it is in the population, the more effective it will be, because it's social coordination. The goal of the trait, if it's a social coordination convention, is to coordinate the social behavior. So more people doing it makes it better. more often, I doubt you're going to see this kind of linear relationship very often. I think more often you're going to see one like this, sort of power law curve, where the more frequent it is in the population, its effectiveness goes way up, and it's sort of in a drastic way like this, where once it becomes well established, it's much, much better. Now, think about driving on one side of the road or the other. If you have 95% of the people driving on the right and 5% driving on the left, it's still a mess. You really need 100% cooperation on there to get real effectiveness. And in that case, effectiveness would be more dichotomous, where even 5% is going to mess things up pretty bad. So it's either a mess or great. So I would expect social coordination conventions to have this kind of distribution. And I also think that social coordination conventions is a much bigger category than it may seem at first glance. Even something like, I said before with the chopping down the tree example, I said, imagine that the chopping down the tree does not occur in a social context. Well, of course it does. And the method you use to do that may be dependent on social factors and what your other folks are doing. If there's other things to consider beyond just which one gets the tree down most quickly. Say, which one makes the most noise that bothers your neighbors, then you might choose a different method, say. It's off the top of my head. But there's lots of things that are social coordination conventions that we don't usually think of as such necessarily, but that do have this characteristic that their effectiveness in helping us achieve our goals is dependent upon their frequency. So something like, do we choose to eat with chopsticks or with silverware? Either one will work, but because preparing food and eating food is such a social activity for us, we don't usually do it in isolation by ourselves. We usually do it socially. It's good to have a convention regarding which one is normally the way it's done, because it'll help determine how you prepare the food. Are you going to prepare it in such a way that it's in bits and pieces and you can eat it with chopsticks easily? Or is it okay to give somebody a steak because they can chop it up with a knife and fork? Those kinds of conventions, they are social coordination conventions, even if at first glance it may seem like independent individual choice. There's a lot of these things in technology where you might think it's individual choice, but really it pays to pick the one that everybody else picks, regardless of whether it's the one you would have picked independently. Long ago, in the early days of electricity, there was what was called format wars between direct current and alternating current, with Edison advocating direct current as the way to get electricity from place to place, and alternating current, or AC, being Westinghouse and Tesla's favorite, and they're the one they eventually won. As a result of that fact, everybody knows that when you want to design an electronic device, you need to design it so that it can handle alternating current, because that's what comes out of the wall everywhere. However, it also means that you have to have one of these if you have a device like a computer that really works better on direct current, which most do. Direct current's better for a lot of devices than alternating current. So you end up with this big hunk of junk that heats up and so on. So there's a cost to it, but the cost is minor compared to the benefit of the coordination. Similarly, but maybe more trivially, the VHS Betamax wars from the 70s and 80s. Betamax, I only think I ever watched maybe one or two things on Betamax before they went out of business. My understanding is that Betamax was technically better. You got a better image out of it. But it was not marketed effectively by Sony as compared to JVC and VHS, and so VHS ended up winning. Now, why does it matter that we be on the same page regarding what tape we use? Well, we want to be able to share tapes, and you want to be able to go to the video store and buy or rent a tape. And there got to a point in the 80s when you could go to a video store and they didn't bother to stock Betamax anymore because it had fallen out of favor, because this became the social coordination norm. So these kinds of choices may seem like individual choices, but really they're so socially embedded and so embedded in the act of coordinating our behaviors with that of others that they're not independent choices. They're social coordination norm choices. So even though we may think, well, I really wish I could use beta because it's got a better image, you're going to get a VHS machine because it's what everybody else has. Until DVDs came along. And of course, recently we had another format war between HD DVD and Blu-ray. And again, debates about which is better. Blu-ray ended up winning that one. And again, for somebody like me, who's not into this stuff, I'm not a techie guy, I don't really care which one wins as long as one wins, so that I can reliably pick one and know that I'm going to be able to get DVDs that will work in the machine and that I can swap with other people and so on and so forth. Coordination is what matters. If it's the effectiveness of the trait is highly dependent on its frequency, it may persist despite not being the best imaginable for the behavior in question. Good example of this is the QWERTY keyboard. So this is an ancient typewriter from the 19th century, and my understanding is the QWERTY keyboard was designed not to speed up typing, but to slow it down, because these old typewriters with the levers that went flying up had problems with jams. So you want to slow down the rate at which the levers go flying up so that you don't end up with jams. And I'm old enough that I remember typing on manual typewriters, not this one, but manual typewriters where you did occasionally get these jams of keys up in the thing. The QWERTY layout slowed down the typing for most people such that you didn't get too many jams. It got well established as the standard keyboard because once you want to have a standard keyboard, even if it's one that slows things down, so that when you can go from keyboard to keyboard, you know where the keys are going to be. And if you learn how to touch type, like I did in high school, you don't want to have to look at the keys. You don't want to be punting and pecking. Just tappity tap tap and you can do your work. Even though nowadays it's on a computer, and conceivably I suppose we could all have our own individual keyboards that we carried around with us and plugged into devices wherever we went, and it would be designed for us. We don't do that. We rely on the fact that wherever you go, you're going to find a QWERTY keyboard. Except if you've traveled to Europe and gone to internet cafes and stuff like I have, you'll find frustrating things like the Z is where the Y should be. And you have to get used to that. And they don't realize that it's wrong. So, and even handheld devices. So even though handheld devices, there's no really reason to use a QWERTY keyboard or a handheld device. You're not doing this. You're not doing touch typing. You're hunting and pecking with your index finger or your thumbs. But you still see a layout, a QWERTY keyboard layout, because it's a convention. It works as a convention, not in terms of speed. So I'm almost done. Finishing up here, imagine all culture traits. That's too big. Don't consider all culture traits. Consider only culture traits that have clear behavioral reference. Narrow it down that way. And then within that, focus our attention, because they're likely to lead to better predictability of behavior, on social coordination norms and conventions. But also realize that this Venn diagram here is a misrepresentation of reality, because my suspicion is that actually should be a very big circle that takes up a lot, the vast majority probably, of culture traits that have clear behavioral reference, that they have something to do with the coordination of social behavior, the interaction that we do between each other. So that the list of things that fall in this category can be quite large. It can include language, like Kurzban pointed out, and as other folks have pointed out in the past. Technical standards so for engineering and so on. There has to be a standard way of doing things. Dining conventions, chopsticks, silverware, kin terminologies. Doug Jones at Utah has written some interesting stuff about kin terminologies and social coordination. Moral rules. Kurzban, again, with his student Peter Discioli, has written interesting things about the ways in which moral rules can help us coordinate our behavior, so that if we want to be able to know who to punish for violating moral rules and know who to reward for following moral rules, the existence of a moral rule helps us coordinate that behavior and get on the same page regarding who gets punished and who doesn't. Institutions in the John Searle sense of, well, I'll skip that, but institutions are coordination norms. Clothing can be coordination norms if they convey information like uniforms do, to help us coordinate our behavior. Time zones. We didn't used to need time zones because you lived in a town or a village and you wouldn't move from town or village fast enough that you would need to coordinate the time it is here with the time it is over there. Trains came in, you needed time zones so you could coordinate times. So train companies, railroad companies brought them initially, and then the government took over the time zone business. Rules of the road, obviously driving on one side of the road or the other, but one I read about in the New York Times a while back, is that in the Netherlands, there's so many bicycles in the Netherlands that they have a convention regarding how you open your car door if you're the driver, where you don't do it in America where you just open your car door and get out. You reach over with your right arm and go like this and open the door with your right hand, so that you're forced to look back and see if there's a bicycle there, so you don't open the door up into somebody riding their bike. So that's an interesting convention in a specific cultural setting. Measurement systems, used to be lots of them. Now there's really just one, plus the one we use. but it's important to be on the same page regarding measurement systems. FGM is shorthand for female genital modification or mutilation. This may seem an odd one, but I put it in there because in my field setting, among the folks in East Africa that I studied, the Maasai and Mukugaro folks, there's a sense in which even the custom of female circumcision, as it's euphemistically called, is a social coordination norm because there's a belief that women cannot get married unless it happens to them, and that it's improper to marry a woman to whom it has not happened. And the efforts, there's people on the ground now, local activists, who are trying to break this connection so that FGM is not considered a necessary part of not just one's personal life, but of one's social life. And they're having some success in convincing people not to do it. Money coordinates economic behavior, social geography, where are the roads, where are the gas stations, the banks, coordinates social behavior. And my final silly but favorite example is toilet paper roll placement. I had a roommate in grad school that he and I didn't have a lot in common. We didn't hang out much, but he had a room and I rented a room in the apartment he was renting out. And he believed, erroneously, that the toilet paper ought to come off the back of the roll. And I believed correctly that the toilet paper ought to come off the front of the roll. And every time we went to the bathroom and used the paper, we flipped it around for 2 years. We never said anything to each other about it. It would have been good. It would have been better if we had coordinated our behavior on that, but it's, the cost was minor. And there's an entertainment value to be able to tell you guys about it now. So, but there is a value to coordinating that among people who at least share the same bathroom, so that you're in the dark at night. You're not wondering, how do I get my hand on? Even something like that. So my point is that when you start thinking about it, you start realizing that if you go back to this category, culture traits that have clear behavioral reference, that category is dominated by this kind of stuff, I think. And that, therefore, our intuition that culture shapes behavior in powerful and important ways, which is, of course, a very, very popular observation in anthropology, is right. It does. But it does for reasons that we can understand. We don't have to just treat it as a mystical fact. It does it for reasons that we can understand using things like evolutionary theory. I've got this final thing about those predictions. Basically, the trust game shows you one thing. Let me just focus on this for now. QWERTY keyboard, I talked about that already. Trust game shows you the robusticity. One of the findings from those studies I didn't mention, but I'll mention it now, is that those findings from both the Kenyan study and the US study could have been undermined if we had found that the people who followed the Osotwa norm, the people in those framed games, had taken home more money as a result of doing that. Then you could have argued that, well, they're just taking home more money, they're just looking out for themselves. But the fact is they actually took home less money. But they did it anyway. So there's a sense, at least, that one example there, that there's a robusticity in the face of short-term costs. Again, I wouldn't expect that to hold true over a long run once people get a chance to figure out what the cost is. But in the short run anyway, there's a robusticity there. And then the cultural distinctions among human groups, I think that's almost true by observation. If you look at what defines one group versus another group, it's typically social coordination conventions like language. So that if you drop yourself in the middle of France, you can be pretty sure you're going to run into somebody who speaks French fluently. And do the same thing in Germany, they're going to speak German fluently. Very different languages, very different linguistic coordination conventions. But other kinds of culture traits don't lead to cultural distinctions like technology. Technology can flow from place to place. So the cars are the same. Cars work the same in France as they do in Germany. So I think, again, that's almost true by inspection. It could be tested rigorously, but it seems just on the face of it to be true. And that, I believe, is pretty much the end of it. I've got various people to thank. And my final slide. Thanks. I know that went a little longer than the convention, so sorry. And then Dan's got the first question, of course.
So I like the general enterprise thing, and I agree with you on many things, but that isn't a particularly useful thing to
Right,
say. So
right. Thank you.
let's get that out of the way. I worry that that your portrait of culture using, culture bearing agents is too shallow, because they're strictly driven by, at least in the way that you presented it literally, by conscious or close to conscious cost-benefit
Yeah,
calculations.
right, right.
And that then matters in terms of where the rubber hits the road with regard to your prediction about the ease of
Right.
intersocietal transfer of coordination norms, for example. So there's some things which, and by way of evidence of the point that I'm going to make, I'll just point to the humor with which you repeatedly refer to people doing things wrong, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
They don't
I knew you'd
drive
pick
on
up
the
on that.
left, they
Right,
drive on the wrong side of the
Right,
road.
right,
You
right.
drive on the right side
Right,
of the road. And the point that I want to make is that part of the evolved psychology of acquisition, use, and conformity to cultural rules is a moral psychology, such that this is the right way to behave.
Right, right.
And that isn't necessarily an explicit cost-benefit calculation, right? So
right.
one can recognize that, yes, in London, I will die if I drive on the right side of the road, in both senses of the term,
yes,
right? But I still feel that these people are immoral. They're doing it wrong, right? If they were good
Yes.
people, they would drive the way good people drive.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think that some of the most important norms that at least have coordination function, you may not want to call them coordination norms, but they have coordination function, are exclusively about that. So take the culture of honor, for example, right? So Rob once told me that he had a friend from the South who was an academic who thought that we ought to have more fistfights in faculty meetings because people would stop being assholes to each other if you got punched in the face every time you were rude to somebody, right?
This is Rob Kurzban?
No, Rob Boyd.
Oh, Rob Boyd, okay, Rob Boyd.
And then, so that is a social coordination norm, right? So the
Yes.
way that you conduct yourself
Yes.
in the meeting and the way that the meeting
Yes.
progresses, and how turn-taking occurs,
Yeah.
and the kinds of things that
Right.
people say, is all going to be affected by a norm about how you comport yourself. And behind that is a norm about what a good person is.
Right.
And how you respond to transgression as a good person, for example.
Right.
So I worry that your portrait is a little shallow, and while the Rutgers Osatua game is clever, I don't find the results compelling because I think they're demand characteristics that are in that design.
Okay, we dealt with that at length in the revisions of the manuscript after you saw it, yeah.
No, that was it. That
But-
paper you sent to JEP, so I never
Yeah.
saw it, I don't think. Or-
I know you saw an early version of it, yeah.
Okay, well, maybe
Yeah.
that was my objection.
It was.
I don't remember shit.
Yeah, no, your point about the moral content of many of these norms is exactly what I figured your question would be, because you made the same point in 1995 when I talked about culture,
good to know I'm
because
consistent.
you're consistent.
I disagree with
And you're
myself.
totally right, and you were right then too. And yes, it is shallow, it's shallow on purpose, because it's a starting point. So my view of the sort of way this works, in terms of the project of science and the progress of science, is that you start with simple models, you get more complicated. So simple models involve simple decision-making rules, recognizing that the actual decision-making process is going to be something else, something more complicated than that. And I don't think there's a complementarity, I think, rather than a conflict between saying, okay, in terms of cost-benefit analysis, natural selection should have designed us to do X, Y, and Z, and then, but not realizing that may be not instantiated in the psychology of the organism, not in terms of cost-benefit analysis, but in terms of easy heuristics. So here I'm offering the idea that one of our easy heuristics ought to be follow social coordination norms, not because they always help us, but because on average they did for our ancestors. So you end up with folks following norms that actually do have a cost, because it's an easy thing to do, which I think supports the idea that yes, there's a cost-benefit analysis that took place over the long period of time of evolution, but it's not instantiated in that way in our psychology.
Right, no, I agree, and I think, it's kind of a
Yeah.
Robert Frankian view of morality in some
Yeah,
ways and moral
yeah,
sentiments,
yeah,
which is that,
yeah.
those motives evolved to get you to do the things
Yeah.
which,
Right.
At least in the past,
Right.
would have been
Right.
fitness maximizing.
Right.
The problem is that generates a different set of predictions then, right? Because if you think that there is something like internalization where people think you're good if
Yeah,
you act this
right.
way and bad if you don't,
Right.
then
Right.
that means that the problem in shifting from one coordination norm to another isn't just a problem of
Yes,
frequency
there's a moral,
dependence.
right. There's a
right?
moral, yeah. Once a norm gets established, typically people will, that's why the word norm is problematic, is because I want to say convention, to set aside the issue of whether it has a moral component as well, because often norm is read as having a moral component. But yes, once they're established, there is a sense of moral compulsion that you're a bad person if you don't do them. I recognize that. But the fact that they're instantiated in that way is one of the things I want to, for the time being, black box, so that I can make sense of the sort of logical evolutionary structure and the selection pressures that would have led to a particular kind of susceptibility or gullibility or heuristic. But I agree with you that these things are morally loaded. Yeah, typically, very often they're morally
And
loaded.
I mean,
yeah.
it adds a lot to the problem of the adaptive valley between two peaks, right?
Yes.
Because, you know, it's not just that so don't take driving, take elevator behavior, which is one of my favorite examples, right? Where we have a whole bunch of conventions about how you're supposed to act in an elevator, and it works
Yeah.
really well in terms of coordinating what happens, and
Yeah.
people don't get in each other's way and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
If you violate those conventions, you're imposing very, very small cost on the
Mhm.
other people in the elevator. It's not like driving on the wrong
No.
side of the road, okay? But they'll instantly start being suspicious of the kind of person that you are,
Mhm.
because the kind of person who breaks conventions like that is
Right.
either evil or ill, right?
Right.
And both
Right.
of those are dangerous.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Yeah, I agree. There's definitely that dimension to these things, but I think I guess my answer is totally right. Some of these are complications that I want to leave off to the future after we sort of establish the ground rules of how you go about doing this business. And some of it is division of labor, of different levels of explanation, so that you can talk about the selection pressures and then talk about the instantiation in separate breaths. But yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, I think you were next, I'm not sure. Then, yeah.
So your first prediction is that these social coordination norms would be better adopted than other norms.
Yes.
And you listed this experiment as you said, example of that, but it doesn't
Mhm.
really seem to be a test of it. For that, you would need...
That's why I said example. Yeah.
You would need
Yeah.
some sort of contrast, some norm
yeah.
that wasn't.
Yeah.
And it seems very hard to design an experiment like that, because it would have
Right.
to be just like the norm that's a social coordination, except that it's not social coordination.
Yes,
It's
and
hard
that-
to imagine what that would be.
Yeah, and I'm kind of hoping, again, workshopping this, that's where I've come to that point of realizing that and wondering, how would you do that? What I have is not something that's analogous to this. So the closest thing I've got to this is built into the study is the contrast between the folks who knew all about the Osoto norm and so on and so forth, but didn't follow it because it wasn't labeled, the game wasn't labeled the Osoto game. So I think that gets at that somewhat, and I do have arguments about the demand characteristic issues too, but not ideally. So I agree with you that that's like the next methodological hurdle to cross, and I haven't crossed it yet. I do have an example that I had in the slideshow, but you can already see I went too long already. It added another 10 minutes to the show, so I cut it out, of a instance in which there's a culture trait that ostensibly is about a behavior, but in which I have evidence that it does not affect that behavior as you would predict it would. It's not analogous to this exactly, it's parenting. I have slides, I can show them, but in a nutshell, I've got evidence from this field site that many of you are familiar with already that these folks, the Mukogoto, not Maasai generally, but this particular group, they're low status, they're poor. And that they tend, when their children are small, they tend to favor their daughters over their sons. And I've got evidence that this makes some adaptive sense for them, but also that they don't seem to be aware of it, and when you ask them which do you favor, sons or daughters, they say sons. So there's a cultural favoritism towards sons, but it's not reflected in the behavior. So I do have that example out there I can toss out as an example, and I don't think there's some folks who say, well, that's culture too, because it's just a more subtly transmitted culture. It's not verbally transmitted, it's more subtly transmitted. As girls learn how to take care of offspring, they learn to take care of girls better. But I have an answer for that too, which is that in my sample from back in the early 90s when I did a detailed study of this, half of the mothers actually were married in from other groups, from higher status groups that, as far as we can tell, have a behavioral bias in favor of sons as well as a cultural bias in favor of sons. And despite that fact, they still show the same daughter bias once they become Mukogoto, become low status. So I do have an example that runs counter to this from the same population, but it's about a different kind of behavior. It's about parenting behavior instead of this kind of social coordination stuff. But I agree with you, and if anybody has any good ideas for how to do an experiment that would allow, as you said it very well, would be this kind of thing that is not could serve as a social coordination norm, but is not presented as one. Is that what you're getting at?
No,
And
I just the other way around. You can
Yeah.
get something just like the Oshawa
yeah,
thing.
yeah.
In all other respects, it looks just like it, but everyone recognizes that it's not a social
Uh-huh.
coordination solving thing.
That's a tricky thing to do.
Very tricky.
Yeah, I agree with you. That'd be really cool. I'm not sure I can get there. If you got any ideas for how to do that, that'd be great. And I don't know. One of you over here on the right was next. I'm not sure who.
Just following up actually a little bit on what Dan was saying about sort of the depth of what is being done. I mean, it's clear when you're talking about convention, and convention leads to coordination.
Yeah, yeah.
The very nature of
Yeah,
convention.
yeah,
But conventions also have very much a sense of kind of a decision point to decide we'll do it this way as opposed to that way.
Yeah.
It's really the DC.
Either or.
is
Yeah.
a good example.
Yeah.
Where some people are advocating one, others are advocating the other. Eventually one comes to decisions of which
Right.
one does. But coordination comes about for a variety of reasons,
Yep.
not necessarily by convention. There seemed to be, like your giant list at the very end, it seemed
Yep.
to be that one was picking up on many things that lead to coordination are not necessarily by convention. Because
Okay.
I find it hard to imagine
Like-
or to think of language as being by convention. It certainly leads to coordination, but that one has a convention as to what the grammar will be seems to be
yeah.
a little hard pressing to say that in some
Well,
sense folks sort of said, well, we could have our grammar this way. we
no,
could
no.
have our grammar that way.
It had to emerge, right. Most
It
conventions
emerged,
simply
but
emerge. Yeah,
how it emerges and what it emerges from seems to be of a different nature.
yeah,
than Convention, similarly to the work I do on kinship terminology.
Yeah.
But kinship terminology is in the same
yeah.
category. There's not a question of people
Yeah.
sort of sitting down and saying, well, let's,
No, no, no.
instead of
Right.
driving on the right side, left
Right.
side, instead of using this kin term, we
Right.
use that
Well,
kin term.
well, the right and left side, let me jump in, that emerged also from behavior.
Right,
So
right.
it wasn't as if it was just
Right,
imposed.
which
Yeah.
is an example
What-
that we actually were.
That's how these normally come about, they emerge.
Right.
Yeah, yeah,
But I'm
Yeah.
just a little worried that one is putting too much baggage onto the convention side and trying to bring too much under it as if this
Right.
is sort of all encompassing.
Well, the stuff I had in the slideshow about the frequency dependence of effectiveness was an attempt to say, well, what is it about these coordination conventions that can we generalize that in some way that could possibly even be formalized? That was my stab in that direction, but it's just a stab in that direction. It hasn't really gone very far. I do think that language, I mean, I think those things are conventions in the sense that you have to, among people who speak the same language, there's conventions regarding the conventional meanings of words and syntax and so on and so forth. I would accept those. There's a tradition.
There might be some aspects
Yeah.
that are, but putting the whole baggage of language as if it is simply a convention.
Well, I don't want to say simply, that would be stupid of me to say simply a convention, but it's a big, language is a big thing, yeah. But I think I agree with you. I'm sorry, that's my phone going off.
We have a convention about that.
Yeah, I imagine you do. Yeah, I'm violating the moral rule right now. Shut up, phone. Anyway, I think we agree, and I haven't really been able to answer your question, I don't think.
But that might be some of what Dan's bringing up, the question about sort of the moral aspect of it comes into play.
Yeah.
In the sense that there is a real difference between those things
Yeah.
begin to lead to coordination, but rather
Yes.
where the violation
Right,
is not just simply one of
Ooh.
cause-benefit
Right.
violation, but rather there is,
yes,
for whatever reason,
Yes.
there is a moral
right,
imperative that's associated with it.
Right.
It's not just our convention
Right.
that we do that, but I'm morally committed,
Right.
this is my
Right.
convention, whereas there are
right,
many conventions where there's certainly not the case, one has a
Right.
sense of a moral commitment
Right.
to it.
right.
We could agree tomorrow that, well, maybe it'd be better to shift to DC current rather than AC, without
Yeah,
feeling morally.
there's not a moral dimension to it. Although people, I think, even with that, would say, well, no, wait a minute, because people are going to mess it up and get electrocuted, and so they find a way to give it a moral dimension, I would suspect.
Well, that was
and
the
so-
intent at the
Yeah,
time. part
at the
of it,
time, right, Giga Westinghouse, yeah,
Right.
yeah. Yeah, so ideally, it would be great to do an experiment where you could somehow separate out the moral baggage that comes with coordination conventions, which even for the Americans, I think there may have been some of that in why they played the game the way they did when it was labeled the Osoto game. And we have statements from them. We asked them to write us a note, basically, about why they played the game the way they did. So we can go back and look at those and see if they felt some moral compulsion. But it'd be great to have an experiment where you somehow isolated the convention with no moral baggage to it, if that's even possible. And then another one where there is the moral baggage and compare the effects. And I think obviously the moral baggage one would have a stronger effect. And then I got to go with her next because she was next, I think. Pretty sure. Okay.
I'm wondering if there's something totally different going on in your trust game.
Okay.
And I'm coming from ethics, where there are 4 ethical principles.
Mm.
2 of them are utilitarianism and virtue ethics.
Okay.
So utilitarianism is an action is morally right if it maximizes the sum of the utilities
Mm.
of some set of people. And virtue ethics is when you just simply habitually do the right thing without deeply thinking about it.
Okay.
You might use the word culturally rather than habitually. Okay. And now
So-
what you have in your trust game is really a mix of the two, sort of.
Mhm.
So you have the trust game is fundamentally would invoke utilitarianism, because the 2 people would be best off if the first person gives 100%.
Yes, right.
And then the second person, for example, gives back 50%.
Right.
And that solution would also, nobody's expectation would get violated. So
Right.
you have an equilibrium, right?
Right.
Now, and then what you did on top of that, suddenly you insert this message that invokes, in effect, virtue ethics, what you call
okay.
also tua, right?
Yeah.
And we know from other experiments and so forth that when you have a system where there's both virtue ethics and utilitarianism floating around, that virtue ethic tends to get undermined. And so I want to give you an example. Suppose you have a system in which parents are thinking about whether to save for retirement, or alternatively they can use their money to pay for their son's college. Right?
Okay.
And then with the idea that their son, by going to the most expensive college, can then down the line make a lot of money, and then in old age take care of his parents.
Oh, okay.
right?
So even that is utilitarian in that sense.
Well, in traditional societies, it might actually be virtue ethics
Okay.
that's driving that. So the idea is that we have to do everything for our son, that he gets
Yeah.
great, and then the son, in his parents' old age, just simply has to help
Yeah.
his parents, right? So it could be a virtue ethics thing. But now suppose the son actually goes off to college and ends up studying economics, and he learns all about the trust game and so forth, right?
Yeah.
And then in old
Yeah.
age, his parents are getting Social Security and Medicaid, so he says, well, why should I actually pay for them? But his parents are actually thinking not just monetary, they're also thinking of him coming home
Yeah.
and taking care of them when they are feeble, and, right? But so they have, so
Right.
you all of a sudden get a violation, right? And so I think that there's something much more messy going on.
Yeah.
You all of a sudden have a message that's invoking virtue ethics in an underlying game
Okay.
that has a utilitarian sort of streak to it.
Yeah, I guess I can see that. I did another study. I don't know if this is relevant or not, but I've got another study not published yet, where we also did some framing using Osoto and using some other risk pooling. This is a risk pooling system, risk pooling conventions of a different game, what we call the risk pooling game, that goes on. Unlike the trust game, it's a 1-round game. It's really quick. Risk pooling games goes on for many, many rounds. And one of the findings we've had, and maybe this is relevant to what you're talking about, is that the framing effects are there, but they diminish over the rounds. So it's as if there may be, in your terminology, a virtue ethics impact that gets displaced as people learn how to play the game and figure out what really works and so on. You know what I'm
I
saying?
think that's yet
Then-
another effect,
okay.
Yeah.
It sounds similar though with the virtue. So I gotta, if you could give me
I think
references.
The issue is that with virtue ethics, people just don't think at all about. They just simply do what
Yes.
is the right thing to do.
Right.
And if you have a system where there are other ethical principles floating around, or you cue them to think about those other ethical principles, then it tends to undermine virtue ethics. Yeah, because you're starting to
Other ethical principles.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay, other
So if
ethical
you
principles,
invoke
not
other
just
ethical
effectiveness.
principles,
Okay.
It tends to undermine
Okay.
doing things just simply because
That's the right thing to
It's the
do.
right thing to do, and that's
Okay.
nothing more to
Okay.
it, right?
Well, I mean, you should get some references then.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just as a footnote to that, it's important to note that what Suzanne said, that it's the invocation of other ethical principles, not of
Okay.
other motives. Right?
Okay.
So,
Okay.
like.
That's what I
like-
missed the first time too,
like,
but
you
okay,
know,
yeah, okay.
Jeremy Genghis and Scott Atran have done all this stuff on sacred values, where
Yeah.
there's a backfire effect, right? Where you say, well, how much would I have to pay you to change your religion, right?
Yeah.
You
For
know,
example, yeah.
then, once you've
Yeah.
suggested that I might be available for sale, now
Yeah.
I'm even more
You know,
entrenched.
right. Yeah, that's interesting. Right. And there were a couple of questions over there, but are we ran out of time?
We're out of time.
Okay, well, thanks very much. I'm sorry I ran over.